When my cousin Jake and I were in our early 20s, we went on a handful of camping trips around Oregon. This happened, I believe, when I was 23 and Jake was 24. It took place in Pinewood Forest. It was my first time camping there, though not Jake's. It was the middle of the week. Our jobs gave us odd schedules, allowing midweek days off so we'd plan our trips then to avoid crowds and traffic. I always let Jake take the lead. He was the Eagle Scout, not me. We parked near a trailhead by a small picnic area and started hiking into the woods from there. About 20 minutes in, we found a good spot to set up camp. A good spot for us meant a clearing big enough for 2 tents, a campfire, and some space for our portable stove. The first thing we did was unpack and set up our tents. Jake had the whole process down to a science and finished in minutes. It always took me ages, and that trip was no exception. Once our tents were up, we built a ring of stones for the fire and gathered some wood. Jake brought fire starters and a lighter, so yeah, we cheated, but I didn't mind. By the time the sun was setting, we had a fire going, and Jake was grilling steaks and burgers. One thing about him, he always went all out with the food on these trips. He was an amazing cook, so I trusted him completely to handle our meals. Of course, we had bear spray nearby, just in case the smell of food attracted unwanted guests. Jake always said bears were unlikely to bother us, though. He'd say the real danger out here wasn't animals, but people. As we ate, we cracked open some beers and played classic rock on the Bluetooth speaker. If you've never been camping, you can't understand how perfect moments like this feel. Good food, good music, and great company, miles away from everything. Once it got dark, we played cards at this little folding table Jake brought along. After a few rounds of regular card games, we switched to Uno. That's when we heard something out in the woods. I paused the music on my phone, silencing the speaker. The forest was quiet now, except for a faint, eerie humming and the sound of footsteps crunching leaves. Jake motioned for me to grab the flashlight. By the time I found it, the sounds had stopped. Should we be worried, I asked. Jake hesitated. It's unusual, he admitted. Especially this deep in the woods, and especially that humming. We were both unsettled, but we went back to playing cards, keeping the music much lower this time. Then, out of nowhere, a heavy stick flew into the middle of our campsite, hitting the ground with a loud thud. We both jumped. That stick didn't fall from a tree. Someone had thrown it. Jake stood up and yelled into the darkness, "Whoever's out there, stop messing with us. Get a life." We heard footsteps again, this time moving away. "Let's pack up and move somewhere else," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. "Not in the dark," Jake said firmly. "We'll stay put. Just keep the bear spray handy." That night, strange sounds continued, branches snapping and the occasional faint crunch of leaves. It wasn't an animal, it was deliberate. Someone was out there watching us. When it was time to sleep, Jake suggested we take turns keeping watch. He offered to go first and sat by the fire with his book while I crawled into my tent. I woke up in the middle of the night, groggy and disoriented. Something had woken me, but I wasn't sure what. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed a silhouette at the entrance of my tent, someone peering in. "Jake," I mumbled, still half asleep. The figure didn't respond. "Is it my turn?" I asked, sitting up slightly. The zipper of my tent suddenly zipped up, and the figure disappeared. I lay there for a moment, confused, until a cold realization hit me. I shot upright, unzipped my tent, and looked around. The fire was out. Jake wasn't there. I rushed to his tent and unzipped it. He was fast asleep in his sleeping bag. I shook him awake, my hands trembling. "Jake, someone's here." It took him a moment to wake up fully, but once he understood, he grabbed his bear spray and said he must have dozed off. "Sleep in my tent," he said. I ran back to grab my sleeping bag. As I did, I heard it again, the humming, faint but unmistakable, coming from the woods. "Hurry up," Jake whispered urgently. We both got back into his tent, zipped it up, and stayed there, bear spray clutched tightly in our hands. Every sound outside made my skin crawl. The hours dragged on until dawn finally broke. We packed up quickly and hiked back to the car. Neither of us said much on the way home, but we didn't need to. The unspoken understanding was clear: we weren't camping again anytime soon. It's been 6 years since that night. Jake's asked me a few times to join him on another trip, but I've turned him down every time. I can't shake the memory of that shadowy figure looking into my tent, or the unsettling sound of someone humming in the darkness. People are scarier than any wild animal. Whenever I was scared as a kid, my dad would always tell me, "Don't fear ghosts, fear the living. They're the ones who can hurt you." In my late teens, I came into some money after my father's passing. He had taken his own life, and I received an inheritance from him. At the time, my parents owned a small cabin near Lake Elwell, Montana. After Dad's death, my mom decided to sell the cabin because she couldn't afford the mortgage, and renting it out wasn't covering the expenses. The cabin was scheduled to go on the market in about a month. With no more renters during that time, it was sitting vacant. I decided to use it as an escape to clear my head. I quit my part-time job, packed my snowboard gear, grabbed my dog, Shadow, and headed up to the cabin in my dad's old car. The first 2 days were peaceful. I played with Shadow in the snow, went snowboarding, and spent my evenings drinking, smoking, and playing video games. I had stocked up on groceries, liquor, and cigarettes, so I had no need to leave the property. The solitude was exactly what I needed to unwind after everything I'd been through. The cabin was modest but cozy. It had 2 floors. The main floor had a living room, a guest bedroom, and a small kitchen. Upstairs were 2 more bedrooms, one of which was the master with a balcony. I mainly stayed in the living room or the master bedroom, keeping the doors to the other rooms shut. On the 3rd day, a heavy snowfall kept me indoors. I spent the day relaxing with Shadow and playing games. That afternoon, I noticed something strange. While outside with my dog, I saw footprints in the snow near the cabin. They looked fresh, as though someone had been there just 20 or 30 minutes earlier. At first, I thought maybe someone else was staying at one of the 2 nearby cabins. Those cabins were about a block away, and the next closest one was a mile out. However, I hadn't seen or heard anyone during my stay. The footprints led from my cabin toward the dense forest, and then disappeared among the trees. I brushed it off and went back inside. That night, as I was lying in bed, Shadow's ears perked up. A second later, he jumped off the bed and ran downstairs to the living room. My heart started racing as I listened to him pacing back and forth. After a few minutes, he came back upstairs, pawing at me to take him outside. Reluctantly, I grabbed his leash and took him to the driveway. But instead of doing his business, Shadow began pulling hard, trying to drag me toward the trees where the footprints had been earlier. He kept sniffing the side of the house and glancing up at the roof. I had no intention of following him into the woods, so I pulled him back inside, locked the doors, and headed to bed. About half an hour later, I heard something on the roof. It sounded like footsteps, heavy and deliberate, about 6 in total. My first thought was that it might be snow falling from the trees, but the pattern of the steps was spaced out, like a person walking. Shadow ran to the balcony door, barking and whining to be let out. Determined to prove to myself that there was nothing there, I grabbed my coat, flashlight, and a cigarette and stepped onto the balcony. I scanned the roof with the flashlight but saw nothing. The snow on top was undisturbed. Just as I started to relax, my eyes caught something in the trees about 20 feet away. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but as I focused, I saw a figure crouched in the branches of a tall pine tree. It looked human, but it wasn't. It was unnaturally tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, with spindly limbs. Its pale, skeletal arms stretched upward, gripping a branch above its head. Its face was expressionless, with its mouth hanging open in an unsettling way. My blood ran cold. Shadow began pacing and barking behind me, his low growls vibrating in the icy air. The figure didn't move. It just stared. As something deep inside me screamed not to shine the flashlight directly on it. Instead, I slowly backed into the cabin, pulling Shadow with me. Once inside, I locked the balcony door and finally aimed the flashlight at the tree. Nothing. The figure was gone. I shut the curtains and tried to calm myself, but later that night, I heard a tapping at the glass. It was soft and rhythmic, like fingers gently knocking. Shadow stared at the door but refused to approach it. I felt an overwhelming urge to open the door, as if something was calling me. But in the back of my mind, I heard my dad's voice. "Don't do it. Stay in bed." I listened. I eventually drifted off to sleep and woke up at first light. The tapping was gone, but I didn't waste time. I packed up and left the cabin as quickly as I could. To this day, I don't know what I saw in those woods or who or what was out there, but I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps or the sight of that thing in the tree. Some places are better left alone. Years ago, I was browsing classified ads on an app, something like OfferUp or Let Go, searching for a good deal on a phone. This was back when phones like the Galaxy S7 and iPhone 7 were still the latest thing. I found an ad that caught my eye. Brand new iPhone, $300. The listing was simple and generic, but the price was excellent for the time. The seller, a guy named Travis, assured me via text that the phone was brand new, still sealed, and factory unlocked. He even sent me a short video showing the box, which looked legit. Travis seemed polite and easygoing over text. Initially, the pickup location on the ad was in a nearby part of Richmond, Virginia, which was only 15 minutes away from me. But when we finalized the details, Travis told me he was now about an hour west in a smaller town. I wasn't thrilled about the longer drive, but the deal was too good to pass up. I texted a few friends to see if anyone wanted to join me. My friend Erica agreed, on the condition that I treat her to food afterward. It seemed like a fair trade, so we made plans to head out around 8 p.m. Travis told me to meet him at a police station parking lot, which he said was where he preferred to do deals for safety reasons. This made me feel more comfortable about the situation. After picking up Erica, we hit the road. The drive was fun at first. We chatted, listened to music, and joked about how sketchy the whole thing felt. But as we got closer to the address, the area grew quieter and darker. There were long stretches of wooded roads, only occasionally broken up by houses or small businesses. When we arrived at the police station, the parking lot was empty except for a few parked squad cars. We circled the lot but didn't see Travis or his black Nissan Altima. I decided to call him. He picked up immediately, apologizing and saying his car had broken down a few minutes away. He asked if we could come to his location to help jump-start his car, as he had jumper cables with him. Travis sent me his location, which was on the side of a deserted road surrounded by woods. I hesitated. Erica was shaking her head vigorously, mouthing, "No way." She thought it was way too sketchy, and I had to agree. But we'd already driven so far, and I didn't want to waste the trip. I told her we'd at least drive by the location to see if it looked legit. As we approached the spot Travis sent, I noticed the faint glow of headlights reflecting off the trees. There was a black car parked on the side of the road, but I couldn't see anyone inside or outside of it. The whole scene was unnerving. No streetlights, no nearby houses, just endless trees and silence. Erica kept saying, "Just keep going, don't stop." I didn't need convincing. I drove past the car without slowing down. Almost immediately, Travis started calling me. I ignored the first call, but then came the texts. "Hey, I saw you pass me. Why didn't you stop? Turn around." I ignored those too. Erica and I decided to find somewhere nearby to eat. We pulled into a small 24-hour diner a few miles away. The place was nearly empty, except for an older waitress behind the counter. We ordered coffee and sat in a booth by the window. A few minutes later, the door opened and a man walked in. He was wearing a dirty navy hoodie with the hood pulled up. He sat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and kept glancing over at us. I whispered to Erica, "Don't look now, but I think that's Travis." She froze, then whispered back, "How do you know?" When the waitress handed him his coffee, the man said, "Thanks, darling." His voice sent a chill down my spine. It was the same voice I'd heard on the phone. I quietly told Erica we needed to leave. I waved the waitress over, quickly paid for the coffees, and told her we were hitting the road. As we stood up to leave, I noticed the man watching us. The moment we got outside and into my car, I saw him stand up and head for the door. I didn't wait around. I started the car and sped out of the parking lot. As we pulled onto the main road, Erica pointed out a black car in the lot, a car that looked a lot like the one we'd passed earlier. I didn't stop to confirm. I drove fast, heading straight for the highway. But about 10 minutes into the drive, my car's low tire pressure warning came on. The PSI was dropping rapidly. I pulled over to check, and sure enough, the tire had been slashed. I had to replace it with the spare, which took about 15 minutes. Erica and I were on edge the entire time, scanning the road and woods around us. Eventually, we made it back to Richmond in one piece. I bought Erica dinner as promised, but the whole ordeal left me shaken. Looking back, I realized how close we were to walking into a trap. It's a chilling reminder to always trust your instincts and never let the promise of a great deal cloud your judgment. I once worked as a direct care aide for a 65-year-old woman named Martha, who had a developmental disability and dementia. Her daughter, Colleen, was in her 40s and worked overnight shifts. Colleen needed someone with medical experience to watch Martha during the night. I agreed to the job, thinking it wouldn't be much different from my current role as a direct care worker for 2 other women with developmental disabilities. This was my first and only night working for them. And here's why. When I arrived, Colleen introduced me to Martha. Martha smiled politely but didn't say much. Colleen explained that sometimes Martha would get confused and wander around the house at night. But she stressed this wasn't sleepwalking. It was a symptom of her dementia. My job was to calmly guide her back to bed if it happened. Colleen left for work around 9 p.m., leaving me alone with Martha. I stayed in the living room, catching up on a show while keeping an ear out for any noises upstairs. Not long after Colleen left, I heard footsteps above me. I walked to the staircase and called, "Martha, is everything okay?" No response. The footsteps retreated back to her room, and I heard her door close. I figured she had just gone to the bathroom and went back to watching TV. About an hour later, I went to the kitchen to grab a sandwich I'd brought with me. As I turned to leave with my plate, I nearly dropped everything when I saw Martha standing silently in the doorway, her silhouette outlined by the dim kitchen light. My heart skipped a beat. I apologized for being startled and asked if she needed anything, but instead of answering, she began yelling at me. "Who are you? Why are you here? I don't know you." I calmly reminded her who I was, explaining that I was her care worker and that her daughter, Colleen, had hired me. At first, she didn't seem to believe me, but after some coaxing, I managed to guide her back to her room. Once there, I gave her a glass of water and some melatonin that Colleen had left for situations like this. I stayed until she took both, ensuring she was calm before I returned downstairs. Hours passed uneventfully, and I started feeling the weight of exhaustion. There was a small spare bedroom upstairs with a twin bed that Colleen said I could use if needed. I checked on Martha one last time and, seeing she appeared to be asleep, decided to grab a couple of hours of shut-eye. I fell asleep quickly, but it didn't last long. About an hour later, I woke to a sound from downstairs. The sound from downstairs was faint, a creak, like someone stepping on an old wooden floorboard. My mind immediately went to Martha. Maybe she was wandering again. I rubbed my eyes and sat up, listening intently. Then came another noise, a soft, deliberate shuffling, almost like someone dragging their feet across the floor. I grabbed my phone, turned on its flashlight, and quietly made my way to Martha's room. The door was slightly ajar, and I gently pushed it open. The bed was empty. "Martha?" I whispered. No response. I stepped into the hallway, shining the light around. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak. The dim glow of a streetlight outside barely illuminated the staircase. Slowly, I descended, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The living room was empty. So was the kitchen. But as I turned to head back upstairs, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The front door was unlocked and slightly ajar. My pulse quickened. Had she wandered outside? I stepped onto the porch and called out, "Martha, are you out here?" The cold night air bit at my skin, but there was no sign of her, just the stillness of the street and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I turned back into the house, my unease growing. I locked the front door and started back toward the stairs. That's when I heard it again, the shuffling sound. But this time it wasn't coming from the living room or the kitchen. It was coming from the basement. The door to the basement was cracked open, revealing a sliver of darkness. I stared at it, frozen in place. "Martha?" I called again, my voice trembling. A faint sound drifted up, a soft, almost melodic humming. It didn't sound like Martha. Gripping my phone tightly, I edged toward the basement door. I pointed the flashlight down the stairs, illuminating a narrow wooden staircase leading into darkness. The humming continued, steady and haunting, echoing off the walls. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I descended the stairs, step by hesitant step. The air grew colder with each step, and the humming grew louder. At the bottom of the stairs, the flashlight beam swept across the basement. Old furniture, dusty boxes, and a laundry machine sat in the corners. And then, in the farthest corner of the room, I saw her. Martha was standing there, her back to me, facing the wall. She was humming, swaying slightly from side to side. Relief washed over me, though it was tinged with unease. "Martha," I said softly, stepping closer. "It's late. Let's get you back to bed." She didn't respond. I reached out, gently touching her shoulder. Her humming stopped abruptly, and she stood unnaturally still. "Martha?" She turned her head slowly to look at me, not fully, just enough that I could see her face in profile. Her eyes were wide, glassy, and filled with an expression I can only describe as pure, unrelenting terror. "They're here," she whispered, her voice hoarse and trembling. Before I could respond, the flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. Then, from somewhere deep in the basement behind me, came a low, guttural growl. I didn't wait to see what it was. I grabbed Martha's hand and bolted up the stairs, dragging her behind me. The growling grew louder, accompanied by heavy, deliberate footsteps. We reached the top of the stairs, and I slammed the basement door shut, locking it. Martha clutched my arm, shaking violently, her eyes still wide with fear. I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my keys, wrapped a blanket around Martha, and led her outside to my car. We drove to a nearby diner where we waited until morning. When Colleen returned, I told her everything. Her face went pale as I described the events, and when I mentioned the growling, she hesitated before speaking. "This house, it's old," she said, avoiding my gaze. "There always been stories. I never went back to that house. Colleen moved Martha into a care facility shortly after, and we lost touch. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that humming in my dreams, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't pulled her out of that basement in time." It was New Year's Eve of 2020, and we were all ready to say goodbye to what had been a truly awful year. My friend Logan was throwing a house party to celebrate, and I arrived early to help him set up. I secured a spot to sleep in his parents' room, which meant I could drink without worrying about driving home. Logan's parents, of course, weren't home for the night. The party was lively, with most of our close friends from the group there, plus a bunch of Logan's friends I didn't know. At midnight, everyone cheered Happy New Year and clinked their drinks in celebration. Slowly, people began filtering out, heading to other parties, bars, or home for the night. By 3 a.m., it was just Logan, our friend Cody, and me. The house was quiet except for the low murmur of our conversation. Cody was half asleep on the couch while Logan and I nursed our drinks. We were on the verge of calling it a night when we started hearing a faint creaking noise. At first we brushed it off, assuming it was just the fridge or some other appliance making typical house noises. But as the sound persisted, it became harder to ignore. "What's that noise?" Logan asked, glancing toward the kitchen. We decided to investigate. After a quick sweep of the kitchen, we realized the sound wasn't coming from there. It was louder near the basement door. Logan cracked open the door and called down the stairs, "Yo, who's down there?" The creaking stopped immediately. We stood frozen, staring into the dark abyss of the basement for what felt like forever. After a minute of silence, Logan and I exchanged a look. "We should check it out," I said, though my heart was pounding. "No way," Logan replied. Eventually, though, we agreed to go down together. In our drunken state, we thought it'd be smart to grab knives for protection. Looking back, we probably would have hurt ourselves more than anyone else with how much we'd been drinking. We descended the stairs cautiously, the only sounds being the creaks of the steps beneath our feet. The basement wasn't huge, just a couch, a TV, a bar, a table in the corner, and some old, cluttered junk. It was messy, but not the kind of place someone could easily hide. We checked every possible hiding spot, combing through the shadows and piles of stuff. Nothing. "Maybe it was nothing," Logan muttered. That's when I noticed a rocking chair. It sat in the corner of the basement, old and unassuming, but something about it caught my attention. I walked over, placed a hand on it, and gave it a push. The creaking noise was identical to the sound we'd been hearing all night. I sat in the chair and rocked it again. The sound filled the basement. Logan's face went pale. I stood up, every hair on my body standing on end. We bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind us. Neither of us said much we didn't need to. Whatever had been moving that rocking chair, it wasn't us, and it wasn't anything we could explain. Logan kept the basement door locked for days until his parents returned. When he told them what happened, they revealed that the rocking chair belonged to Logan's grandmother, who had passed away years ago. His mom had kept it for sentimental reasons. I don't know what to make of that night. I've never experienced anything paranormal before or since, but every time I think about it, I get chills. When I was 23, I had to move out of state for work. I still work for the same company, but I've since been able to transfer back to my hometown. At the time, though, I needed an affordable place to live. I posted everywhere I could think of: Facebook, Craigslist, Twitter, and even my neighborhood subreddit, looking for a roommate. A guy named Rob responded to my Facebook post, saying he had a room available. I checked out his profile and pictures, and he seemed normal enough. My parents were hesitant about me rooming with a guy, but I figured as long as he seemed trustworthy, it would be fine. We arranged a FaceTime call where he gave me a virtual tour of the house. It was a modest place in the middle of town, just a 10-minute drive from my new office. Rob told me he owned the house outright, and his price and rules were both reasonable. He also said the room was available immediately, which was perfect for my timeline. A week later, I packed my things and made the move. Rob greeted me outside the house and handed me the key. The first thing I noticed was that he was shorter than I expected, eye level with me, and he seemed eager to help carry my heavier bags inside. He showed me to the room, which was furnished because a friend of his had recently moved out. I swapped out the bedding with my own, then spent the rest of the day settling in. Rob was friendly and tried to get to know me, which I appreciated, though I didn't get any overly friendly vibes yet. The next day, he offered to drive me around town to show me the area. I agreed, thinking it would be a good way to get off on the right foot. He pointed out shopping centers, restaurants, and other spots, but then he suggested grabbing lunch. I wasn't hungry and politely declined, but then he started pushing for us to go out for drinks instead. I declined again, explaining I didn't drink on work nights. His persistence was a bit uncomfortable, but I stayed polite. His mood shifted suddenly, and he went quiet. The change was unnerving, but I brushed it off, focusing on adjusting to my new job. A few days later, while doing laundry, I noticed my clothes in the hamper didn't seem the way I had left them. Worse, I discovered a pair of my underwear was missing. My stomach sank. The thought crossed my mind that Rob might have taken it, but I didn't want to believe it. Still, I decided to install a lockable doorknob on my bedroom door. I swapped it out one afternoon while Rob wasn't home, That night, around 1:30 a.m., I woke to loud banging on my door. It was Rob, calling my name angrily. Terrified, I pretended to be asleep, and eventually, he stopped. The next morning, I received several texts from him demanding we talk. When I asked if it was about the doorknob, he confirmed it was, and insisted I remove it. I apologized, explaining I just felt safer with the lock. He grudgingly agreed to let it go, but the interaction left me uneasy. A few days later, while Rob was out, there was a knock at the door. A girl about my age stood there. She asked if I lived with Rob, and when I said yes, urged me to leave immediately. She told me Rob had multiple restraining orders from other women and was known to be a dangerous stalker. I was stunned. She explained she'd seen me moving in and waited until Rob wasn't home to warn me. I thanked her, took her number, and started packing immediately. I found a studio apartment across town that I could move into quickly. I texted Rob, fabricating a story about needing to leave for family reasons. He agreed to return my money the next day. That night, Rob knocked on my door asking, "Did someone talk to you?" I played dumb, but his question unnerved me. I woke up in the middle of the night to a horrifying sight. Rob was sitting at the foot of my bed, a shadowy figure in the dark. I screamed, and he clamped his hand over my mouth, whispering, "Shh." I begged him not to hurt me, and he responded, "Why would I hurt you?" He then began caressing my leg, saying, "I don't mean to scare you." I bolted out of bed and ran for the door. He shouted for me to stop, but I ran outside and called the police, hiding in the bushes until they arrived. The officers made Rob come outside, where he denied everything. I explained what happened and requested their presence, while I packed the rest of my things. I also demanded Rob return my money, which he did under the officer's watch. One of the cops pulled me aside and confirmed Rob had a history of arrests involving women. I spent that night in a hotel before moving into my new apartment the next day. Thankfully, the landlord was understanding and expedited the process. The entire ordeal was a terrifying lesson. I will never live with a man I don't know, or anyone I don't know, ever again. When I was 15 or 16, I had a night home alone. My entire family was out for a reason I can't quite remember. At the time, I was a huge gamer, obsessed with StarCraft. I'd often spend weekend nights glued to my PC, and this particular night was no different. It was just before lockdowns began, and life still felt relatively normal, until it didn't. I was deep into a match when the doorbell rang twice. Irritated by the interruption, I hurried to the door, hoping to deal with whatever it was quickly so I could get back to my game. I called out, "Who is it?" as I always did when I was alone. A soft, weak voice responded, but I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like a woman. I cracked the door open, leaving the storm door between us. On the other side stood an older woman with a big, unsettling smile plastered on her face. She had her hands hidden behind her back, which immediately put me on edge. "Can I help you?" I asked through the door. She said she needed to use a phone and asked if she could come inside. Alarm bells went off in my head. Ever since I was a kid, my parents drilled into me the rule, never let a stranger into the house, no matter what. That rule was etched into my brain. I felt awkward and unsure of how to refuse, so I redirected her, suggesting she try the library a few blocks down. Deep down, I knew the library was closed at this hour, but I just wanted her to leave. Her smile didn't waver, but her tone shifted as she said, "That's very rude. to turn away an old lady asking for help. I stammered out, "It's a house rule. My parents don't allow strangers inside," while slowly closing the door, apologizing as I did. She didn't move. She just stood there, her smile frozen, watching me until the door clicked shut. I walked back to my room, trying to shake the weird feeling she left behind. I hadn't even sat back down at my desk when the doorbell rang again. My heart sank. There was no way I was opening that door a second time. Something about her felt wrong. I ignored it and tried to focus on my game, but then I heard it, a clinking sound on the window right in front of my desk. The blinds were down, so I couldn't see what was outside, but I didn't need to. I already knew it was her. The sound of metal tapping on the glass sent shivers down my spine. I turned off the computer sound and sat frozen for a moment. Finally, I decided I'd had enough and moved to another room in the house. I sat in the darkened living room, heart racing, when the doorbell rang yet again. I tried to convince myself she wasn't dangerous, just confused or maybe not all there mentally. But then came the third and fourth rings, and I resolved to confront her again. This was something that happened so long ago that a lot of details are a little blurry. It's not like it happened yesterday. I'll try my best to fill in smaller details that I don't fully remember with how I best remember things played out. It was the last day of school. I was in the fourth grade. Fourth grade was the last year in our elementary school where kids had to be picked up by their parents. Fifth graders were allowed to walk home on their own. My mom would always be the one to pick me up on the last day of school. My friend Dennis and I had a play date planned to celebrate the last day of school. Dennis wasn't in my class this year, but we had been friends since kindergarten. He was in a different dismissal hallway from me. After school was over, we single file lined up and walked to the exit door at the end of the hall, where we waited outside by our teacher, Miss Blue. I waited for Dennis's dad to appear from the crowd of parents shuffling in and out of the parking lot next to the doors. Then I heard my name, Tommy. Tommy. I look over and see a man waving at me as he approached. He introduced himself as Dennis's uncle and said he was picking me up. I went over to Miss Blue and said I'm being picked up. She asked, "Where is he, sweetie?" And I pointed to Dennis's uncle, who waved at Miss Blue. Miss Blue dismissed me, and I went with the man. He led us through the crowd and was a very quick and jittery talker. Like he spoke fast and had a bit of a stutter. He was walking incredibly fast. It was almost hard to keep up with him. With my backpack on, he explained to me that his brother, or Dennis's dad, was working later than expected, so he was driving me back. We got to his car, which was a dark red hatchback type car from what I remember, and it took me this long to acknowledge the giant elephant in the room. Where was Dennis? Why weren't we picking him up too? The man turned to look at me in the back seat and said that Dennis was already at his house. I was shy around people I didn't know, especially adults, and I wasn't one to openly speak my mind. If I was confused, but I was very confused, this was making less and less sense. The whole drive, the man kept yapping, telling stories of his days in elementary, asking me questions, like what sports I played, what we're learning in class. If I had to guess, we were in the car for like 10 minutes, which honestly, for our town, where houses were right on top of each other, that was a while. My house was a 5-minute walk away from the school. We were definitely in an area I wasn't familiar with, when he parked the car in front of his house. His house looked pretty normal to me. From what I remember, he let us inside and shut the door and locked it behind us. It was really, really dark inside the place, and I realized why all the curtains were shut. It almost felt like it was nighttime in there, especially because the only source of light was a dim lamp in the corner of the room. He then looked at me and smiled. I said, "Where there's Dennis." And he started acting really jittery and nervous, seeming he said something like, "Oh, I think he's downstairs playing video games. Give me a second. Wait, here." He then disappeared into a nearby room, and I heard a door open and then footsteps descending into a basement. I know my heart was already racing. I knew I was in danger. I went to the door to quietly try to open it, but I couldn't. It had some kind of lock that must have needed a key, for I really started to panic now, yet I still probably held out a little bit of hope that Dennis would be coming up those stairs, but I knew the chances of that were slim. I regretted entering that house. I did the only thing I could think to do. I went to the kitchen and found a phone hung on the wall. I picked it off the receiver and dialed 911. The first thing I said when they answered was, in a whisper, "Please come to this house. I've been kidnapped." They heard me. They acknowledged me, but I didn't say another word. I hid the phone under a towel in the corner of the room, with 911 still on the line. I hurried back to where the man left me, as I already heard his footsteps coming back upstairs. Then he called my name, saying, "Come down. Dennis is down here." Then there was a pause. He repeated my name, and when I didn't answer, he came up the stairs, flayed to look at me. He asked me if I was okay. I felt so sick, and I was so scared. I hated myself for walking into the situation and not being wiser. I asked in a very scared voice if I could leave, and I remember the change in his face. His Eva-friendly smile disappeared as he realized that I was no longer falling for this. He walked closer to me in a gentle manner until he was close enough to grab my wrist aggressively, and he started pulling me towards the basement. I screamed and cried, and he screamed at me. "I'll let you go if you stop and behave." So I listened. I went down the stairs, and halfway down, the door slammed shut behind me, and I heard it lock. I walked fully down the stairs to this empty, unfinished basement with a concrete floor and one singular sup. It was New Year's Eve of 2020, and we were all ready to say goodbye to what had been a truly awful year. My friend Logan was throwing a house party to celebrate, and I arrived early to help him set up. I secured a spot to sleep in his parents' room, which meant I could drink without worrying about driving home. Logan's parents, of course, weren't home for the night. The party was lively, with most of our close friends from the group there, plus a bunch of Logan's friends I didn't know. At midnight, everyone cheered, "Happy New Year," and clinked their drinks in celebration. Slowly, people began filtering out, heading to other parties, bars, or home for the night. By 3 a.m., it was just Logan, our friend Cody, and me. The house was quiet except for the low murmur of our conversation. Cody was half asleep on the couch while Logan and I nursed our drinks. We were on the verge of calling it a night when we started hearing a faint, creaking noise. At first, we brushed it off, assuming it was just the fridge or some other appliance making typical house noises. But as the sound persisted, it became harder to ignore. "What's that noise?" Logan asked, glancing toward the kitchen. We decided to investigate. After a quick sweep of the kitchen, we realized the sound wasn't coming from there. It was louder near the basement door. Logan cracked open the door and called down the stairs. "Yo, who's down there?" The creaking stopped immediately. We stood frozen, staring into the dark abyss of the basement for what felt like forever. After a minute of silence, Logan and I exchanged a look. "We should check it out," I said, though my heart was pounding. "No way," Logan replied. Eventually, though, we agreed to go down together. In our drunken state, we thought it'd be smart to grab knives for protection. Looking back, we probably would have hurt ourselves more than anyone else with how much we'd been drinking. We descended the stairs cautiously, the only sounds being the creaks of the steps beneath our feet. The basement wasn't huge. Just a couch, a TV, a bar, a table in the corner, and some old cluttered junk. It was messy, but not the kind of place someone could easily hide. We checked every possible hiding spot, combing through the shadows and piles of stuff. Nothing. "Maybe it was nothing," Logan muttered. That's when I noticed the rocking chair. It sat in the corner of the basement, old and unassuming, but something about it caught my attention. I walked over, placed a hand on it, and gave it a push. The creaking noise was identical to the sound we'd been hearing all night. What would you do if the forest itself seemed to conspire against you, pulling you deeper into its grasp? Well, that day I discovered just how far it could go. Hiking has always been my escape. I won't call myself an expert, but I've spent decades traversing the major trails in America and exploring over 75% of the country's national parks. Over time, though, I've had to find new ways to keep the thrill alive. Recently, I began scouring Google Maps for unnamed forests and setting off into the unknown. It was unconventional, maybe even risky, but the added excitement made it worth it until one particular hike changed everything. That day, I decided to explore Dudleytown Forest in Connecticut. The place has a reputation, abandoned since the 1800s. It's steeped in creepy lore stories of strange occurrences, unsettling silence, and the inexplicable. None of that mattered to me, though. I don't believe in ghosts or superstitions. To me, it was just another place to explore, one that was conveniently close to home. Technically, the forest is off limits, but that hadn't stopped me before. The fact that it was private property only increased its appeal. I'd have the entire area to myself. I arrived around noon, parking my car just outside the forest's edge. This was my usual strategy to ensure the sun wouldn't set before I finished my hike. As I stepped into the woods, my first impression was unsettling. The stories about Dudleytown being dead silent weren't an exaggeration. I don't mean quiet like a normal forest. I mean silent. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hum of insects. Just the sound of my own breathing. It was eerie, but I chalked it up to the forest's reputation amplifying my imagination. I kept walking, placing my route marking stickers on the trees as I went. It's a trick I developed over the years to avoid getting lost. These homemade stickers are easy to spot and peel off, ensuring I leave no trace behind. The lack of sound, however, made the act of sticking them on trees feel louder than it should have. As I ventured deeper, the silence began to feel oppressive. Usually I find peace in isolation, but this was different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, and I kept glancing over my shoulder even though I knew I was alone. I tried to distract myself by focusing on my surroundings, but the uneasiness lingered. Then I heard it. A sound broke the silence, sharp and piercing, a wailing, almost like a mournful moan. It was distant but distinct, cutting through the stillness of the forest. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I froze in place, trying to make sense of it. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before, but I convinced myself it had to be. Maybe a wounded deer? The logical part of my brain told me to turn around and leave, but curiosity won out. I decided to continue, resolving to leave at the next sign of anything unusual. As I walked, I couldn't shake the thought of how strange it was for an animal to get injured in a forest that seemed devoid of life. Was there a hunter nearby? If so, I hadn't heard a gunshot. Maybe it had happened before I arrived. Still, the idea of someone leaving an animal to suffer like that didn't sit right with me. Lost in thought, I nearly missed it, the carvings. A tree directly in front of me was marked with strange symbols, scratched deep into the bark. They weren't letters or numbers, just random slashes and jagged patterns. I scanned the area and realized several nearby trees were marked the same way. My heart sank. This wasn't normal. Someone or something had been here, leaving signs I couldn't interpret. That was my breaking point. I turned around without hesitation, pulling off my trail marking stickers as I went. I was done with this place. The forest had won. But as I retraced my steps, something felt off. Ahead of me was a cave or den that I was certain I hadn't seen before. I stopped, confused. I know myself, and I know there was no way I would have missed something as significant as a bear's den. I scanned the area, and then it hit me my trail markers. They weren't at shoulder height. Where I'd placed them, they were now waist high. My blood ran cold. Someone had moved my stickers. Not only that, but they had repositioned them to lure me toward this cave. I felt a wave of panic as the realization set in I wasn't alone. Someone had been tracking me, watching me, manipulating my route. I didn't have time to think. I turned and ran, crashing through the forest without a care for how much noise I was making. My only focus was getting out. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something chasing me. But without my stickers to guide me, I had no idea where I was going. I stopped to catch my breath and pulled out my phone, praying for a signal. By some miracle, I had one bar. I quickly checked my location and figured out the direction of my car. Relief washed over me. At least now I had a chance. And then the wailing started again. This time it was louder and closer, echoing through the trees. My relief evaporated as I bolted in the direction of my car, the sound seemingly right on my heels. My lungs burned and my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't dare stop. Every few seconds, I glanced over my shoulder, but nothing was there. The sound was relentless, a haunting backdrop to the most terrifying run of my life. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the edge of the forest. The wailing stopped as abruptly as it had started. I stumbled out into the open, gasping for air, and scrambled into my car. My hands were shaking so badly it took me several tries to get the key into the ignition. When I finally managed to start the engine, I didn't look back. I sped away, leaving the forest and whatever had been in it far behind. That day ruined hiking for me. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. My best guess is that someone, a hermit or a woods dweller, lives in those woods and noticed me before I noticed them. For some reason, they decided to track me, move my stickers, and lure me toward that cave. As for the wailing, maybe they used a whistle or some other device to create the sound. But there are holes in that explanation. How could someone keep up with me while blowing through a whistle for so long? And why would they go to such lengths to scare me? To this day, I don't have answers. Maybe there's a reason Dudleytown Forest is off limits to civilians. All I know is that I'll never set foot in those woods or any other unnamed forest ever again. The sprawling tianguis of Mexico City stretched as far as the eye could see, a labyrinth of makeshift stalls and tents overflowing with wares. The air was thick with the aroma of street food tacos al pastor, freshly fried churros, roasted corn, and the steady hum of haggling voices. It was here, amidst the chaos, that I stumbled upon the vendor who would change my life. His stall was unassuming, tucked between a woman selling colorful rebozos and a young man hawking pirated DVDs. Yet, something about it drew me in. Maybe it was the glint of polished metal catching the sun, or the faint, sweet scent of copal incense burning nearby. The vendor himself was unremarkable, a middle-aged man with sharp features, dressed in a plain shirt and jeans, but his eyes gleamed with an unsettling intensity. Looking for a miracle, he asked, his voice smooth as honey. I stopped, intrigued. What kind of miracle? He gestured to the small table before him, lined with hundreds of tiny metal charms milagros. Shaped like hearts, arms, legs, and other symbols, they were traditionally offered at churches as prayers for healing or blessings. But these milagros were different. They seemed alive. Their surfaces gleamed unnaturally, and when I leaned closer, I swore I felt a faint warmth emanating from them. These aren't your ordinary charms, the vendor said, leaning in conspiratorially. Each one carries a blessing far greater than you can imagine. Choose wisely, and it will grant your deepest desire. Skeptical, I raised an eyebrow. And what's the catch? He smiled. A chilling twist of his lips. No catch. Just a small price to pay. At the time, I didn't think much of it. My life was in shambles, struggling to make ends meet, drowning in debt, and stuck in a dead-end job. The idea of a miracle, no matter how improbable, was too tempting to pass up. I picked a charm shaped like a small heart. It was intricately detailed, its surface etched with swirling patterns that seemed to shift when I turned it in my hand. "What do I do with it?" I asked. "Keep it close," he said. "It will know what you need." I paid him a few pesos and left, the charm tucked into my pocket. The first miracle happened 2 days later. I had stopped at a local cafe on my way to work, and as I reached into my bag to pay, I found a crisp 500 peso note tucked inside. I didn't remember putting it there, but I chalked it up to forgetting. Later that week, I received a call from an old acquaintance offering me a lucrative freelance project, something that hadn't happened in years. It was as though my luck had turned overnight. At first, I was elated. The money from the project paid off my rent, and I even had enough left over to treat myself to a nice dinner. The charm stayed in my pocket, its warmth a constant, reassuring presence. But the miracles didn't stop. Within a month, I had landed a dream job, reconnected with estranged family members, and even met someone I was beginning to fall for. It felt too good to be true, and it was. The accident started small. A neighbor fell down the stairs and broke her leg. A colleague at work slipped on a freshly mopped floor and ended up in the hospital. Each time, I felt a strange sense of unease, like a shadow hanging over me. Then, one night, as I was walking home from the Tianguis, I saw a news report on a street vendor who had died in a freak accident. A bus had lost control and veered into his stall, killing him instantly. I froze when the image flashed on the screen. It was the same man who had sold me the milagro. Desperate for answers, I returned to the market the next day. The vendor's stall was gone, replaced by a woman selling handmade soaps. When I asked her about him, she shook her head. "He's been gone for weeks," she said. "But you're not the first person to ask." Her words chilled me. I began researching milagros and their history, delving into archives and folklore. That's when I found stories about cursed charms, items imbued with dark energy, often tied to sacrificial rituals. These milagros didn't just grant blessings, they demanded something in return. The price wasn't money, it was life. The connection became clear. Each miracle I experienced coincided with a tragedy: my neighbor's fall, my colleague's accident, the vendor's death. The charm wasn't just granting me luck, it was taking it from others. Terrified, I decided to get rid of it. I threw it into a canal, watching as it sank into the murky water. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of relief. But that night, I awoke to the sound of whispers. The whispers were faint at first, like wind rustling through leaves, but they grew louder, more insistent. I checked my room, my windows, even stepped out into the hallway. Nothing. When I returned to bed, the charm was on my nightstand, gleaming in the moonlight. I tried everything: burning it, burying it, even taking it to a church. Each time it found its way back to me unscathed. The blessings continued, but so did the deaths. One evening, I received a call from my mother. My cousin had been in a car accident. She didn't survive. I broke down, the weight of the charm's curse crushing me. I had to find a way to end it. I sought out a curandero, a healer known for dealing with dark forces. His small home was filled with herbs, candles, and religious icons. When I showed him the charm, his face paled. "This is no ordinary milagro," he said. "It's tied to an ancient ritual, one that requires a life for every blessing it grants. The soul of the vendor must still linger, bound to the charm. You're not just carrying a cursed object, you're carrying him." "What do?" I begged. The curandero instructed me to perform a cleansing ritual, one that involved offering my own blood to sever the charm's hold. But he warned me the charm might resist. The ritual was grueling. In the dead of night, I stood in a circle of salt, a candle flickering in front of me. I pricked my finger and let a few drops of blood fall onto the charm. As soon as the blood touched it, the room grew icy cold. The whispers returned, louder than ever, joined by the sound of footsteps pacing around the circle. Shadows danced on the walls, contorting into grotesque shapes. Then I saw him, the vendor, his face twisted in rage, his eyes burning with an unnatural light. He lunged at me, but the circle held. "You took what wasn't yours," he hissed. "Now you'll pay the price." With the last of my strength, I recited the curandero's prayer, begging for forgiveness and release. The charm began to glow, its warmth turning to searing heat. I dropped it, and it shattered on the ground, releasing a deafening scream that seemed to shake the very air around me. When the light faded, the charm was gone. So was the vendor. It's been months since that night, and my life has returned to normal. The blessings stopped, but so did the tragedies. I've learned to appreciate the small joys in life, free from the shadow of the milagro. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers like wind rustling through leaves, and I wonder, did I truly sever the charm's hold, or is it still out there, waiting for its next victim?